All right, how is everybody? Back in the locker room again. Today we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about threat versus safety theory. And fundamentally all this says is that we have two basic physiologies. You know, there's a whole spectrum and we can, whittle it up. But to be reductionist about it, we have two basic physiologies, the physiology of threat and the physiology of safety. And that we need to understand the differences in these two clearly, from all aspects, whether it's from inflammation or immunity, cardiac function, brain function, but including cellular function and from a metabolic standpoint, and how the threat physiology differs from safety physiology. When we're in threat physiology, particularly chronic threat physiology, we're prone to illness and disease, whereas when we're in safety physiology, we have a sense of wellness and health. So what's very important is to understand our total threat load. It's easy to identify specific threats kind of in the moment, but understanding our total threat load and mitigating the total load, not just a single instance of threat, is what's important. And we're not going to avoid threat in life, right? That's not possible to completely eliminate threat and danger in life. But what we can do is have a better understanding of threat and therefore have a better sense of how we can mitigate the threat load. So, going to just roll back in time a little bit just to think about, go back 4 billion years when the Earth is just now being populated with life forms, very simple, small, single-celled life forms, no internal organelles. And think about what their priority would be to survive and evolve into us. But their priority would be able to identify in their environment threats and also be able to identify when they're safe. And they would need a defense system to evolve to avoid the threats and the danger in their environment. And that's kind of very foundational to actually who we are. So, 4 billion years ago, we saw the evolution of bacteria and archaea, and we shot off of the archaea line, but we encompassed bacteria, and they live symbiotically within us and things like our mitochondria. So we very much so came from those very first forms of life on Earth. Now, as we go forward, billions of years, and all of a sudden we're starting to see multicellular organisms where, cells are connected to each other and stacked on each other and three-dimensionally related to each other. We saw multicellular organisms. So that was an evolutionary leap, but that took billions of years to happen, and someplace around 750 million years ago, we started to see bigger organisms that looked a little bit more like us with, skeletons inside. And as you get a bigger organism, you need networks to communicate across the expanse of the organism. So therefore, not only do you see skeletons, but you start seeing neural networks. And you start seeing vascular networks. So the neural network communicates through neurotransmitters and electrical gradients and all that kind of stuff. And the vascular network delivers stuff, right? Stuff flows through blood, including things like hormones and white blood cells, which are a major factor in our defense system, and other stuff too. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in our story, because the intercellular communication system is still intact in us. And my contention is that this intercellular communication system, it was foundational. It came first. It may still remain primary in how we function, but we barely recognize it in the world of medicine. We recognize it much more so in basic science type research, and we're starting to kind of get into this intercellular communication strategy of defense and of illness and disease, but also in wellness and health. We're starting to get there just around the fringes of medicine, and I think it's really important that we incorporate that into our models of illness and disease. So the other thing that I like to point out is that when we look at models of illness and disease, and we do look at it at this cellular level or even the molecular level, that we focus a lot on the effects of inflammation and free radicals and our immune system. But there's a piece that we continually leave out of the story, and that's what's going on at that level from a metabolic standpoint. So to sort of digress a little bit, go into a little bit of an analogy, if we're under threat, we need a defense. And so think about going to war and the defense systems of going to war. We have armored vehicles, we have tanks, we have ships, we have aircraft carriers, we have subs, we have planes, we've got jet bombers, we've got satellites. So we have all of these things for defense, and they can do stuff like shoot bullets and drop mortars and drop bombs and perhaps even use lasers, and we have all of that. But we have to get those things typically somewhere. They have to mobilize to provide the defense. Now we do have some, sort of land-based missiles and stuff that don't move, but in general we're moving people and we're moving equipment to fight a war. How do they get there? What do they need to get there? They need fuel, and guaranteed every war planner is strategizing the fuel needs and getting those into place. Well, we're the same. So when we think about our defense system, we need to think about how we get fuel for defense and what that looks like in terms of our endocrine and metabolic function, because that's very significant to the development of illness and disease. And I've said this before, it is my contention that this kind of thinking really does a great job of explaining the majority of our illnesses and diseases, including mental health issues and addiction. And wildly, when we go down this theory of threat versus safety, it does a lot to explain some of our sort of political, social, global, environmental even strife that we have in the world. Now, we're not going to get all the way there today. We're just going to kind of get this sense of a theory of threat versus safety. So, before I go to the board, I just again want to point out we need to understand the physiology of threat versus safety completely. We need to be able to clearly understand our total threat load as individuals, but also, as a society and as a globe. Threat load is important. And then we need to understand all the components of mounting a defense, including, this aspect of cell-to-cell communication, and keeping in mind, where do we go to get fuel for a fight and even a flight, in a defense state. Okay, so with that, let's go up to the board. So the first thing I want to talk about is actually safety. So we talked a lot about threat, but let's, and we're not going to talk a bunch about safety, but let's touch base on it here just as a foundation, then we'll move off to threat. So in a state of safety, so when we have safety physiology flowing through us, What do we look like? Well, we have a mobilization state of breed and feed, basically go out, connect, bond, reproduce, find food, a higher energy kind of state that's very much highly social, including having empathy, and highly sexual, including having great fertility, and we're also really smart here in a safety state, and we're very creative. So this has to do a lot with these kind of brain functions, the newer cortical brain functions that we tend to talk about that are a little bit more towards the frontal lobes. I particularly highlighted the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and some language areas on the board here. But we also have sort of a less mobile, sort of immobilized state of digest and rest in safety physiology, where we tend to have a good appetite. We tend to have a regular physiology, including our bowels. We tend to be a little chilled out here. It's a very regenerative state, very restorative. We're building tissues in this state. We tend to sleep well and have, sweet dreams. So a lot of this stuff here isn't so much up here in the cortical function. So I've kind of represented this down here in the brainstem, in the medulla, by these two little nuclei, the dorsal motor nucleus and the nucleus ambiguus, which are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So kind of our safety nervous system here that flows out up into the brain, but also out to other tissues and organs throughout our body. So this is coming from sort of the top down. Now we're going to get down here into the cellular level. So these guys are little cells floating around in their environment. And what we see is all these speckles around these cells, okay? So these are cytokines, and we call them safety cytokines because they go with safety physiology. And our cells, many of our connective tissue cells, including white blood cells, but a lot of other ones, endothelial cells, epithelial cells, fascial cells, glial cells, you go on and on, are producing these cytokines who communicate from cell to cell. They can flow through the bloodstream and get to distant locations and communicate as well. Well, what do the safety cytokines do? Well, they're anti-inflammation, so we feel pretty good because of that. They're anti-nociception, meaning they decrease our pain signals, so we don't have as much pain as well. And they're anabolic, as I said. They build tissues back up, not just muscles, but all of our tissues, and repair our organs and that type of thing. And I've just put a few of them down here, 3 of them, interleukin 4, interleukin 10, and then transforming or tissue growth factor beta. So a lot of the growth factors that you see are safety cytokines. So we feel pretty good here, right? But we're not in a great position to defend and attack when we're in safety physiology. So let's kind of flip the table here and let's go over to threat and threat physiology. So over 100 years ago, a guy by the name of Walter Cannon identified our fight and flight response. So I'm going to kind of start there. And the one reason I comment on that is we're still we haven't progressed that far in the last 100 years clinically in how we actually, address the threat physiology or this defense state. But in general, so in fight or flight, it's a mobilization state, right? We got a lot of action going. We're gonna be swinging or running. Something's going on. So we're gonna see a boost in our immune response, because in the old days prior to antibiotics, if we got bit by the tiger, that could be a problem. We needed an active immune response, and that is associated with an active inflammation response as well. The heart rate goes up, the respiratory rate goes up, and the metabolic rate goes up, and it's biased towards the production of glucose. Glucose is very important for the fight and flight. So what do we see that we don't tend to activate, right? That we actually turn off, we turn down. Our gastrointestinal tract goes down. It's not a time to get, a hamburger at McDonald's when you're running from the tiger. We're not going to put any resources there when we need our resources for the fight and flight. Our genital urinary tract also shuts down. And our reproduction type functions turn off as well. So those hormones that are important for that go down, as do the reproductive organs are relatively dormant. We see a change in vision. We tend to get very focused and tunnel visioned on the threat. And we have a change in hearing, not only in what sounds we're going to hear, we're going to be more biased to sounds of threat, but also what we actually comprehend. Our advanced language centers in the purple here are relatively turned off, and our cognition tends to turn off. So we see a decrease in cognitive function, some of the frontal functions of the brain. And then we're also, going to see some decrease in some of the social connecting functions of our physiology, including of our brain. Okay, if we can't win the battle in fight and flight, then we will flip our physiology to falter to faint. Okay, this is actually an immobilization response where we all of a sudden decide we're not going to win, spending more resources, more energy, more metabolism is not the answer here, and so we're going to tend to want to become a little bit submissive, curl up in a ball and hide somewhere and immobilize for a while, not only to hopefully that whatever the threat is goes away, but also so that we can start healing. So we're going to see a decrease in the immune response, but here, interestingly, the inflammatory response will stay elevated. We'll see a potential fall in the heart rate as well as the blood pressure. We'll potentially see a fall in respiratory rate, metabolic rate goes down, gastrointestinal function stays suppressed, genital urinary function stays suppressed, and our reproductive type functions also stay suppressed. Up here, we are a little bit more plugged into sensations, the stimuli from the environment. Here our sensations actually get a little bit dull and start to wane, even to the point where we start losing kind of that internal sense of ourselves as we move more towards a state of collapse, and our cognition can dramatically fall. So not only are these, these higher cognitive functions here, higher brain functions here going offline, but some of the deeper brain functions, characteristically in the cingulate, gyrus, and the insula are also starting to shut down. So we're starting to really conserve resources, even more resources from the brain and other areas of our body when we get into falter and faint immobilization. So in fight or flight, we tend to be angry and aggressive. In fight particularly. When we go into flight, we get more fearful, we become very reactive and very vigilant. When that fails us and we're moving into falter faint physiology, then we tend to become more sort of submissive. It's a little bit of a surrender strategy, and we want to withdraw and hide. We get very paranoid, right? That vigilance can turn to paranoia about what those threats are out there and how we're going to evade them. And that bias, that threat bias here can make us even more prejudiced, which can be problematic. And then we can end up in collapse. And when I say collapse, this is not just fainting and physical collapse. This can be also sort of an emotional collapse and even a cognitive collapse. So that is where we can feel, very numb and disconnected from the world. So, that some of these brain functions are dialing it down up here, these higher brain functions. But deeper in the brain, what's going on? Well, geez, this amygdala, this little almond-shaped nucleus that is in our two temporal lobes, is red hot. So that's that's kind of our threat center in the brain, and so it's activating other parts of the brain? Well, some parts of the brain are relatively shut off. It's activating the parts of the brain that can do this for us that are very important in a defense state. And most specifically, you know, we've got sort of this the outline of the hippocampus and the hypothalamus and the pituitary, but this is where we also tend to talk a lot about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, where we're putting out some hormones, this corticotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, to put out ACTH and vasopressin. Those are two threat hormones, and the ACTH communicates directly with the adrenal gland, and all of a sudden from the adrenal gland we're starting to see the release into our bloodstream of adrenaline, of aldosterone, and of cortisol. So those are kind of all our vasopressin, aldosterone, cortisol, and adrenaline are sort of our typical threat hormones that we think about, right? Okay, so that's going on kind of up here, and then we come down into the brainstem and down into the spinal cord. In the spinal cord here, where we have highly represented the sympathetic nervous system, sort of the activating nervous system that plays a big role in jacking up our heart rate, respiratory rate, metabolic rate. Now the sympathetic nervous system gets very active, and the parasympathetic nervous system, kind of this breed, feed, digest, rest, chill part of our nervous system, goes relatively offline. So this purple stuff is getting down regulated while this red stuff is getting jacked up. Well, that's the model that we tend to live in. Even 100+ years after the defining fight and flight, we still are connected to the neural network and the vascular network, and we are relatively ignore the intercellular network here. So I've represented the little circles are the cells with a nucleus and some little organelles inside, and the speckles are the cytokines. But they're playing a very active role in this threat physiology and in a defense response. So these cytokines, these threat cytokines, they increase inflammation, they increase nociception, so they make us feel pain more or more painful, and they increase catabolism, or the breakdown of tissues. Why are they breaking down tissues? Why do they do that? Because we need fuel, and our tissues are our fuel stores. And it's not just our fat tissues, it's all of our tissues are potential fuel sources, including these guys up here that we don't need so much for the fight and flight. This is very important to consider in many of the things we talk about every day: COVID, Alzheimer's, all the neurodegenerative disorders. This metabolic effect is significant up in the higher parts of the brain, but we need to think about the entire body, and where are some good resources for fuel in a defense state under threat physiology. Okay, so we've kind of covered that. That was quick, and then we could talk a lot more about all of that, but what I want to move to now is, so we need to understand threat. We actually really don't have a great grasp of what a human being sees as threat. Not what we think about threat, but what our body sees as threat. So we have to know that so we can define our threat load and identify where the threats are, and then we can have a treatment strategy that interfaces with all of those levels of threat. So I'm going to start kind of at the top. So I'm going to start with spiritual threats here, okay? So these are things that don't involve tissue trauma, but our body still perceives them as a threat, and the system tends to behave pretty much the same way here, right? And safety kind of behaves the same way, whether we're safe emotionally or safe physically. We get essentially the same physiology. So, oh boy, well, I can never spell. It's always like a fun thing to see where the spelling errors are here. Okay, so under spiritual threat, we're talking about, the potential, an emotional threat, an emotional attack, or an emotional injury falls under the spiritual realm. Somebody who has had adverse childhood events may carry that threat forward with them for a long time. But so anyway, emotional injury or threat will activate the threat system. Social injury or threat. So social injuries are things like discrimination, disenfranchisement, and injustice, but also either living in isolation or living in crowding. Just you can't get your space. That they all activate the threat physiology. This is huge. Financial threat, poverty, whether it's lack of work, a lack of a meaningful wage, or somebody who gets into too much debt. All of that stress, that insecurity of life, financial insecurity is a threat, activates this system, okay? And now, even our own thoughts, if we have, chronically sort of rehearsing negative scenarios and negative thoughts, our thinking, and our thoughts may not be reality, but our thinking can activate the threat response and threat physiology. So we got to keep that in mind when we're assessing somebody's threat load, and what we're kind of talking about today is assessing illness and disease, right? So we need to know that. We tend not to. We tend to ignore that. Even more difficult to assess are the things that exist in the shadows of the brain. So we're still working top down. If these cortical functions are sort of represented here primarily, these shadow functions are kind of down in the center, in the hollows of the brain. But we have predictive codes running throughout our body, essentially, but particularly, running in the brain. So every species is out there sensing their environment for threat versus safety. That is something that's going on all the time. We say that a bacteria doesn't have awareness like we do. Well, these things we're not aware of. We're still doing them, very similar to a bacteria in archaea. We're assessing that environment for threat versus safety. So these are below our level of awareness, and so they can be somewhat difficult to elucidate, right? And then we have history of trauma in our life. These may be physical traumas, or more importantly, these sort of emotional traumas, and those memories associated with them tend to go down into the area of the brain that is below awareness, and into those cells that are below awareness. They'll bubble up in dreams or in flashbacks, or just in a sense of insecurity and anxiety in daily life. But traumatic memories in the shadows of the brain can jack up the threat response. And then our thoughts, sometimes we suppress them. If we don't like them, negative thoughts, sometimes we'll compartmentalize them away, and they can activate this system. And probably more importantly is the emotional repression, these aversive emotions that we don't want to feel, we don't want them to bubble up. Particularly, we don't want them to bubble up on us sort of in the middle of the day when we're out in society, and we want to appear like we've got everything together. We don't want to break down, but sometimes we just don't want to feel them. They're unpleasant kind of emotions, and so we're gonna repress them. We're gonna stuff them away, and not deal with them in the moment, and maybe ever. And so they sit in this shadowy energy that keep this threat physiology roaring through our body. So these shadowy things are a little harder to deal with. Now we get all the way down to the physical stuff, and this stuff tends to work more bottom up, right? Instead of working, sort of top down from the cortex of the brain into the shadows of the brain. Now we're getting down into the brainstem and the spinal cord, these physical threats tend to work a little bit more down in the cellular level and in the reflex level too, of things, information coming in and out of the spinal cord and the brainstem. A little more kind of automatic, but definitely they can be somewhat out of our level of awareness until they start to actually make us feel sick. So let's just talk about physical threats. Infections, like things like prions and viruses and bacteria and protozoans, these things that can get into us and use us as their resource to survive, and that they will clearly activate this threat physiology. Inflammation goes up. Initially we'll turn on our immune response, and our metabolic rate's going to go up. We might mount a fever and things like that. But then the next category is trauma. And we did briefly talk about some emotional traumas. Down here we're really talking about the physical traumas, being attacked or assaulted, physical abuse falls in this category. So do accidents. We can have significant physical trauma in accidents. So that's going to juice up the threat physiology as well. And then the thing that we, don't pay a ton of attention to is toxins. And they will do the same. So pollutants, people with air that live in an environment with high levels of air pollution, they're going to have elevated threat cytokines. You can Google it. Interleukin-6 is going to be elevated if you're living in polluted air or have polluted water. Pesticides can do the same. Molds have toxins as well. Medications can be toxic to us. We actually prescribe toxins at times that can activate this. It's really important to look at medication lists and decipher which ones have toxic side effects that may be actually making this whole scenario worse. Substances, substances of abuse, alcohol in higher doses will increase these cytokines, right? They'll injure nerve tissue. Opioids are part of the threat stress system. So opioids can cause a lot of this physiology as well as being addicting. So we have to consider substance use. We all know the adverse effects of tobacco and tobacco smoke and lung cancer, right? So, this stuff at a cell level is getting activated. And yes, these threat cytokines, if they go on too long, they can induce cancer. And then down here I put radiation as a toxin. I'm not sure it belongs there, but clearly excessive radiation, even UV light, can cause damage to our cells. So we have kind of this spectrum. Now, keep in mind that this is a total threat load, and all of us have some of this stuff going on, right? And maybe higher here in some, or higher here in some, but this is all going on. And this whole system, from the little cytokine communicators to the cells into the reflex nature of the spinal cord and the brainstem, up into the shadows of the brain and into the limbic system and the hormonal aspects of the brain, and up into the cortical aspects of the brain. These guys are kind of engaging stuff at different levels. Well, the signaling runs both ways. If you get a tiger bite down on your toe and you puncture the skin and puncture the fascia and puncture a blood vessel and crack a bone, these guys are going to signal the system all the way up. If somebody insults you or rejects you or discriminates against you, or you are subject to a significant injustice, from this level, we're going to activate the same system, and it's going to go all the way down to the big toe, okay? So that's why it's so important that we understand not only this whole spectrum, but this whole spectrum. Okay, so let's flip over here now and talk about, we talked a lot about acute threat here and what we do in acute threat. So let's kind of imagine what happens when threat becomes chronic. what does our body now look like? We have a sense of the physiology, the potential different physiologies of fight and flight and falter to faint, and what can we end up looking like when we're under chronic threat. So we're going to go over here. Well, we talked about, and we have illness and disease here. I could argue that we probably should have aging up there, but we're never going to eliminate aging completely. So you can think of premature aging in this scenario as well. But we mainly want to talk about, sort of the ideas of illness and disease under chronic threat. Well, our bodies are more inflamed, okay? So we're going to be not only, more sort of irritable, but we're going to be more painful in that case. We're catabolic. Well, long term, that is presents as degeneration in tissues. That can be degeneration in bone mass, like osteoporosis, or degeneration in cartilage, like arthritis, or degeneration in tendons or discs, or degeneration in the central nervous system, like the neurodegenerative diseases, okay? We already commented on being a little bit more irritable. We're going to tend to be predisposed to anxiety. If the cytokine levels get even a little higher, we're going to tend to get a little less like this and a little more like this. We're going to look depressed. Our cognition is going to start to falter. We're going to be a little dissociated from some of these higher cognitive functions. We're going to want to isolate. We become less social. We become less sexual. Our appetite goes down. Our bowels are no longer regular. We tend to be constipated, and if the threat cytokine levels get really high and we have a little extra inflammation in the intestine or the lining of the bladder, but not only that, if the cytokines tend to want to open up intracellular junctions to let big fat white cells get through for a defense and to spill some proteins out for a defense, we tend to spill some of that fluid into our intestines, and we get more of an irritable bowel syndrome, which isn't a hypermotility syndrome. It's a cytokine syndrome. Anyway, and we'll tend to be fatigued. We may have some insomnia. We may be a little bit, slightly hypervigilant, and the idea of lying down and falling asleep with a tiger breathing over our shoulder doesn't allow us to sleep. And then we tend to be numb, okay? And we talked here about collapse and how this collapse can be both physical in terms of fainting or syncope or shock in an infection, but also that this collapse can be emotional. Well, this numbing over here, we can think of it the same way, is that not only may we have less in the way of sensations, and frequently people who feel really numb, they have a desire to feel something. They'll even cut sometimes in a severe depression. But it's the emotional numbing as well, where, there's just a lack of sort of bandwidth of emotions. So, it's not just that people are sad. They're really beyond sad. They're emotionally numb, and they can't reach happiness and joy in this state. And then we'll point out here that as all of these functions are falling, we also have poor immunity, okay? If we are really in an energy conservation state chronically, kind of like this falter faint physiology chronically, we're also not going to produce the fuel or prioritize immune cell function, and our immunity falls in this state. And this is a coordinated effort of this one big system, starting with kind of resource preservation at this point at the very top, and going all the way down into this intercellular environment with a change in the cytokines. And let me point out that it's not those, it's these. It's these cytokines that are running the show in chronic threat physiology. And now our defense system has become maladaptive at this point. We're now starting to sort of fall apart at the seams because we're in a state of pro-inflammation, pro-nociception with pain, and catabolism, and literally our tissues are degenerating kind of right in front of us. So that's what I want to present as sort of the theory of threat versus stress, and or I should say threat and stress and defense versus safety, and kind of to differentiate what we look like in these two different states. And again, I want to reinforce that we have been pretty good at this piece of it and pretty good at sort of this piece of it. We tend to in clinical application, ignore this piece down here, the intercellular stuff and the cytokine stuff, and we even tend to ignore the top of it, what's going on in the cortex of the brain when we're in threat and trying to mount a defense. I also wanted to point out we need to be able to calculate a total threat load. We can't just say, oh, I've got COVID here, point out that it's a virus that's the problem, when we come into the virus with this entire threat load. And this may explain again why certain populations are suffering more and dying at a higher rate of COVID. The virus that they're getting is the same, but this threat load may be dramatically different in different people. So we wanted to stress the importance of threat load, and as I've reiterated multiple times, we want to make sure when we're talking about chronic illness and disease that we are paying attention to what's going on down at this cellular and molecular level, including not just for inflammation and immunity and nociception, but including the metabolic aspect of what's going on and how that gets reflected in illness and disease, particularly chronic illness and disease. And we didn't even get to really touch on the scenario of chronic mental illness and disease, but it follows this theory very well. So that's all I want to present today, and we'll come back and dig into some of this other stuff in more detail at a later time. Thank you.